Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Amanda, and I'm the Executive Director of CCI North Alberta. We are pleased that you could join us today for our quick and timely town hall Q&A session on COVID-19 and how those restrictions affect condominiums. I'm not going to take too much time off the front end with introductions just because we have a pretty tight schedule today. Because we do have limited time, we're going to focus our questions on COVID-19 and the restrictions and the state of emergency and just how those issues are affecting condominiums. As I was saying, we have limited time today, so we're going to be focusing our questions on COVID-19. We are, as is tradition, we will be having a more general legal panel in the coming months. We've got some submitted questions in advance, so we're going to start there. If you have a question during the session that you'd like to ask, I recommend putting it in the Q&A rather than the chat. The Q&A is just a little bit of an easier way to get our attention with over 200 people on the line. The chat is going to be full, and I can see that it's pretty full there. With that, I am going to introduce our panelists, who will be familiar faces to anyone who has, familiar voices to anyone who has come to a CCI North Alberta event before. Hugh WIllis from Willis Law and Victoria Archer from Gledhill Larocque are joining us to answer your questions. So hi, Hugh and Victoria, if you guys could unmute and get ready, that would be great. We're just gonna dive right in, folks. The first question that we have is actually a whole bunch of questions. We got tons of questions before the session, but one theme really stood out, and that was actually, quick bit of context. Earlier this month, Alberta announced a second public state of emergency to deal with COVID-19. That announcement came with new restrictions and new exemptions and rules related to COVID-19. And the picture on lots of folks' mind, as it has been throughout the pandemic, is how do the current rules apply to annual general meetings? Victoria, do you want to start us off? And then we can send it over to Hugh.
Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I think Hugh and I share the thought we still don't have an awful lot of guidance from the government, but we will do the best that we can. First issue that's come to me and everybody else, I'm sure, is what do we do about AGMs? First of all, in March of this year, the government amended the Condominium Property Act so that now not only can, but condominiums must make their AGMs accessible by remote means or electronic means. So those of you who were planning on doing your AGM entirely electronically, you don't have a problem, you just continue. The other option the government gave us was to do your meeting partly by electronic means and partly by in-person. So, of course, the electronic means part can continue. The in-person part is now going to be subject to all of the rules and the requirements and the orders regarding the COVID restrictions. So, just as an overview, masking is required. You are limited to the number of people you can have, basically 2/3 of fire capacity. Physical distancing is required. So those are the overviews of what is required for these meetings. Is there anything more specific that needs to be dealt with, or Hugh, do you want to tip in with something more specific before we get into the more detailed questions?
Sure, and good afternoon, everybody. One of the, I agree with Victoria. We are still piecing this together, and we're doing our best to dig through the resources that are available. One other thing I would put on or add to Victoria's comment is just the idea that decisions by corporations and board members will be deemed whether they're reasonable and prudent. So one of the questions is, and it varies site by site based on your circumstances, your availability of meeting space and whatnot, but is it reasonable and prudent to hold an in-person meeting right now? in the face of the intervening event, which is the second state of health emergency, is it reasonable and prudent to hold an in-person meeting? And that's just a way to frame your discussions at the board level, or if you're a manager, your discussions with your prospective clients, and then obviously from the corporations to their owners.
Yeah, this is Vicki again, and thank you for that, Hugh. Absolutely. I completely agree.
Thank you both. Just keeping on the AGM track, a question we received in advance. Are we allowed to use the restriction exemptions program to ask people to provide proof of vaccine to attend the in-person portion of an AGM, should we choose to hold one?
Hugh, do you want to go first on this one?
Sure, yeah. So there's just some documents that people, as you're looking for more information, just the updates from Alberta Health and the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. And there's one document here that was updated a few days ago, and the title is called the Requirements for the Restrictions Exemption Program. And it talks about space and whatnot, but it's interesting. One of the comments they make on the first page is that face masks are required for all indoor public spaces, regardless of whether we're operating in the restrictions exemption program or not. So at a minimum, masks are required. When it comes to, can you ask for vaccination status, that's usually up to the venue. And if the venue is prepared to do that, then, follow their lead, their instructions. Now, what if you have a common room on site and you're holding your AGM there? If you are participating in the restrictions exemption program, note that amenities spaces in condominiums are eligible for the restriction exemption program, according to these Alberta Health documents. However, you have to comply with everything that's in the restrictions exemption. So, long-winded answer. So can you look to comply with that? Maybe, depending on your particular circumstances. And then furthermore, can you be requesting people's vaccination status? Again, looking at your particular circumstances, if you are participating, then the answer is yes, you could. Now, I would just caution everybody in entering that phase of requesting vaccination status. Is your privacy policy up to snuff? Is your privacy policy prepared and contemplate what happens if somebody isn't vaccinated and how that information is used and disclosed? Do you have another option available for people to attend the AGM if they are either unvaccinated or they choose not to come in person? So what electronic means do you have available for them to participate? It's not appropriate to hold just an in-person meeting, in my opinion. I don't think it's reasonable or prudent to hold an in-person meeting right now without the ability to participate electronically, for the reason that people who are not vaccinated or choose not to be vaccinated, they still have to have the ability to come and participate. That's just my assessment of it.
I guess this is going to be a lot of subjective, meaning my own personal opinion. I have gone through these documents with a fine-tooth comb a couple of times, reading everything I can. There's a few things that really concern me about condos saying they are going to be part of this problem or this program. First of all, the document that Hugh held up, the guidance document, it is very clear that if you are part of this, or say you are part of this exemptions program, it has to apply to your entire facility and it has to apply at all times. So you can't just say, oh, for this AGM, we're going to be part of this program and we're not for all other things. So again, the document doesn't have as much detail as I would like, but that's problematic as far as I am concerned, because particularly on your building, how are you going to make it apply for all things if you're planning on having your AGM in your social room? That means it's got to be applied consistently in your social room, not just during the AGM. There is also the requirement we have all heard about is that anybody who is a member of this program has to be at all times prepared to be audited. But we don't really know what that means. I am assuming that that means you are going to have to keep a written list of everybody who enters the facility. You're going to have some sort of a check mark or a notation that you checked their ID and it was proper, and that you checked their, well, we don't call it a passport, but it is a passport, I suppose. And you're going to have to say whether it showed that they were fully vaccinated, whether they had an exemption, or whether they had a negative test within the last 72 hours. And I would think those are going to be records you're going to have to keep at a minimum. So that's a lot of extra work for a condo. But just as Hugh said, I'm very concerned about privacy. What sort of programs, protocols do you have in place for maintaining the privacy, particularly considering all of this stuff that's on this passport is considered health information, and it's not just PIPA that applies then, it's the health records privacy information there. So I have real concerns about any condo saying they're going to be part of this program. If you are going to have an in-person AGM, I think you're far better to do it at a facility where that facility is set up to do it, and everything that's in there is done under this program. My comments, any chime in, Hugh?
Yeah, I concur. I think the idea, because it's not very often that we find a amenities room on site or an amenity space on site that would have the capacity to allow people to properly distance with the capacity restrictions as well. So if you have a third-party facility, I think that's a better option.
Thank you both for that. You both touched on this in your previous answer, but just if there's some more expansion that we need. Folks are asking, if we do choose to adopt the restrictions exemptions program, what level of enforcement is required?
Well, if you do choose to adopt it, then there is an obligation that you follow it, and there is an enforcement. Now, I strongly discourage board members from walking around their building or their site, approaching people asking for their vaccination status. People walking up and down hallways, what's your status? Why are you in the hallway? I think you're going to get a finger back in your own chest pretty quick, asking who you are, what's your status, why are you collecting the information? But generally speaking, if there is a challenge, if it's a challenge affecting a business or an organization, so that the condo corporation not properly enforcing, that would go to Alberta Health Services. But if there's an individual who is not complying with masking requirements or other COVID-related requirements, at least in Edmonton, the call, as I understand it, goes to 311 to lodge a complaint, and the city would send a peace officer to investigate.
And the problem with that, if any of you have called for the peace officers, they are very busy, and it takes a long time. As the operator of the facility, which the condo board is, if someone wanted to get into your amenity room and you were part of the program, you would have to not allow them in. It's not that you could say, well, I don't like this, but they were kicking up a fuss, I'm going to let them in anyway. Your obligation is to not allow them in. And that could result in some really ugly confrontations at your condos.
Thank you both. I'm going to jump over to some questions that we're getting in the room. The first one, still in the AGMs, back to the AGMs, is from Matthew Room, who asks, due to COVID concerns, can AGMs now be held in Alberta via Zoom or Teams, or has that window closed?
So yes, they can. And as Victoria mentioned, the legislation was amended in March.
I'll just chime in there. The amendment to the legislation was not just a COVID amendment. It is a permanent amendment. So even when we've passed through, hopefully, this COVID crisis, that requirement for electronic meetings will still be in place.
Thank you both. Changing gears a bit, with the fall, with it being autumn, lots of condominiums are looking at some of their annual inspection requirements, especially with how long COVID's been on. Some of them are looking at deferred expansion. So Chantal asks, with respect to reserve fund, do you think it's important to complete unit inspections from inside the unit to look at things like windows, or is exterior inspections acceptable? And is there a difference to the advice you'd give during the pandemic versus outside of COVID?
This is Vicki.
Thanks, Vicki.
As far as that one goes, I think it would be prudent for a board at this time to respond to any complaints they had about leaking windows or other common property issues. But I think any large-scale wholesale inspections of everybody's unit would most prudently be put on hold until we've passed this crisis.
Yeah, it's Hugh here. I think at a minimum, the public state of health emergency. So if we think of, what would cause us to pause going in, well, an emergency would do it. And we have to recognize recognize the significance of the public state of health emergency, how rare these are in the history of the province and whatnot. So in law, we use the phrase intervening event, and certainly this is something that has happened that would cause many decisions to be at least reconsidered. And so at this point in time, I would suggest that the prudent decision would be to delay the in-unit inspections at a minimum until the public state of health emergency has been dealt with.
Thank you, Hugh. Next set of questions are from Habiba, another one of our attendees. They're both I'm just going to handle them both at once. Do you have any advice for handling the legal documents that we need to transmit business electronically, specifically proxy forms?
So
maybe Hugh, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, in the legislation, you can set rules around proxies. Rules must be reasonable for the intended purpose, and the regulations set out a process for that. But like all rules, you have to give at least 30 days written notice, plus the time for service, of course, right? So what that means in plain language is 30 days plus however long it takes you to either mail or email the documents to the owners. So I do recommend that you put some process around proxies. One of the challenges we're finding from a practical perspective with the online meetings is the validation of proxies in the moment. So one suggestion that we are making is maybe ask for a couple of business days before the AGM. All proxies have to be submitted by noon or 4 p.m. on that day. That way, if you have somebody who shows up with 20 proxies, they're able to still participate and use all those proxies. But from a practical perspective, there's been an opportunity for the board and the corporation to validate them beforehand, so that we're not delaying the start of meeting. The online registration is a challenge.
Thanks, Hugh. Vicki, did you have anything you wanted to add in there?
No, I think you covered that one really well.
Perfect. Thank you both. I'm just going to jump back to our pre-submitted session questions, as I think a number of boards are probably in a similar position and it's related. So one of our folks wrote in, we lost our opportunity to have an AGM last year and we have it scheduled for November of 2021. But it kind of looks like we might be facing similar safety issues to last November. So whether or not we're going to do that is in doubt. Should we be modifying our bylaws to allow for online meetings? Legally, we are in violation of the Act, according to this person, but our current bylaws do not allow us to conduct our business online.
Okay, this is Vicki. The amendments that took place in March that allowed for electronic meetings override anything that was stated in your bylaws. Unless your bylaws specifically prohibit electronic AGMs or general meetings, which I doubt, and even if they do specifically prohibit, in my opinion, the Act would still prevail because your bylaws are undoubtedly older than the Act. So the Act would be a change in the legislation, so it would prevail. So as of March of 2021, you have been able to hold electronic meetings. There's no reason to put off your November 2021 meeting. You can conduct that electronically, unless your bylaws say something very strange, and then I doubt they'd prevail over the Act anyway.
Thanks, Vicky. Hugh, did you have anything to jump in on there?
No, I agree.
Perfect. Thank you. Back to the questions we're getting live. One of our attendees asks, someone in my building has disclosed that they have COVID and that they have socialized with other residents in our building. Should all who were present at the gathering get tested? What should we do with the information that was disclosed? And can we, let's just do with that, and then we'll get to the second part of that question in a second. So
well, I think if you have somebody who has informed you that they've tested positive for COVID, again, first thing, you got to have a privacy policy and make sure you're following it. So you don't get to gossip or share or use that information recklessly. That being said, you can use that information prudently. And if you have a circumstance where somebody's putting other people's health at risk, whether it's COVID or whether it's something else, the call would be to the applicable authorities. So I would start with a call to 311 and very express terms that state to them that this is someone who's tested positive and they are socializing where they ought not to be. Second or third, I guess, is have you updated your signage? Have you stated that we have somebody on site who's tested positive? Please make sure you're taking additional precautions personally. Have you added extra hand sanitizing stations? What sort of steps are you taking as a corporation that way? Just to help protect the owners themselves.
thanks, Hugh.
I
Vicky?
completely agree. I will, one word of caution that Hugh mentioned, do not disclose this individual's name to anybody but a public health authority person. If that information came to you as a board member. Now, if it is a rumor you've heard in the building, I think it's still worth reporting.
Yeah, and quite frankly, this one is serious enough. You probably should call your lawyer and roll them into the discussion as soon as possible.
Thank you, folks. I'm just going to summarize that advice quickly to make sure folks got it. You should take precautions. You need to follow your privacy policy. You can post a general notice that there has been COVID in the building and that folks need to be aware and take precautions. You cannot share personally identifying information about the individuals or individuals who have disclosed this information to you. You're encouraged to contact legal counsel, and you're encouraged to contact the appropriate health authority in your area. In Edmonton, 311 is an option, and province-wide, you can call 811. Do I have that right, lawyer team?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you, Vicky. Related, same attendee, but we've gotten this question in a number of places. Can we mandate masks in our building and specifically in building common areas? Vicky, do you want to jump in?
Sure, I'd say not only can you, but you should. It is a requirement under Order 42 2021 that all people in public areas are masked, indoor public areas. So yes, I think you need to get your signage up. The only place, as far as I'm concerned, people should be without their masks is in their own private residences.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that condo common areas, including hallways, elevators, stairwells, will be deemed indoor public spaces by the applicable authorities. So I think the clear expectation is that people must be masked.
Thank you both for that. This one's a bit of a quick clarification. Just what is the fire code capacity limit in the current COVID restrictions?
Well, I think in Calgary, it's
building.
Or go ahead, Victoria.
Go ahead, Hugh.
Well, I just got back from, I've been back and forth between Calgary just with some family stuff. And in Calgary, it's 1/3. And I just got back in town last night. I've not looked to see if there's an update in Edmonton, if it's 2/3 or 1/3.
Okay, so that might vary by region. The best thing to do is to check your local municipal authority. Is that, and Vicky, do you have anything on that one?
Just a sec. I wrote a note down on that when I was going through guidance. Just a second. Let's see if I can find it. Documents are rather lengthy, so I wrote these things down so I'd remember them.
Thank you both for, also, let's just take a quick moment to thank Vicky and Hugh for doing the research that was involved in getting ready for this session. There are dozens and dozens of pages of documents at this point, and we really, really appreciate them taking time out of their busy schedules to provide some advice and some perspective on the fast changing situation with COVID-19.
Okay, on, I believe it's 42, 2021. It has limits, 42, 2021. And the limits for occupancy, it says 2/3 of fire code capacity or 5 people, whichever is the greater.
Thank you.
That is part 9, page 13 of that guidance document.
And I
Perfect.
think that
Or that
municipalities,
order, sorry.
I think municipalities may have added their own restrictions as well.
Yeah, they may have made it more restrictive.
Yeah. So 42, 2021, just for our crowd, is the number of a public health order. Again, we'll send the link out about that, but those are available on alberta.ca/COVID if you know where you're starting to look. So the provincial rule is 2/3 fire capacity, but as Hugh and Vicky have just explained, some municipalities have moved more restrictive bylaws to deal with their local context. So specifically Calgary has moved with a 1/3. So you may need to check your local authority bylaws, and you're welcome to email info@ccinorthalberta.com if you need some help trying to track that down, and we'll see what we can do to assist. Next question. Can you provide a link? Yes, Carolyn, we can provide a link. We will send that out. So, question from someone from First Service Residential. Could you just provide some perspective on asking for proof of vaccination for keeping gyms and pools open? Like specifically, what are the privacy issues that boards need to be aware of, and any advice for navigating those?
Sure. So it starts.
Sorry, Amanda, could you just read the last part for keeping what open? I missed the last part.
Sorry, Victoria, thank you. So the question is around using the restriction exemption program to keep gyms and pools open. And the question specifically on what privacy issues might condominium corporations be facing, and tips for navigating those issues.
So I'll start off on that one. Is I think the starting place is a lot of condo corporations still don't have a privacy policy and a privacy officer. Now's the time to get one, like appoint one. And if you do have a privacy officer, then now's the time to have a discussion about COVID specifically and certain personal information. And I think you want to document, you've had that discussion, and document what your outcome is. So if you are going to try and keep your amenity rooms open, whether it's the pool or the social room or whatnot, you do have to follow the restrictions exemption program. And that has a fairly detailed process set out by Dr. Hinshaw and the province. So you do have privacy obligations that you need to be aware of. Again, what information you get just because you're a condo board has to be used appropriately and for what the purpose it's intended. So you're not to be sharing it outside the board. You can't be gossiping it. You can't be using it recklessly. There was a case many, many years ago here in Alberta where it was a townhouse style complex with sort of a courtyard, and some board members started having a discussion about someone's personal circumstances, why they couldn't pay their condo fees, and it got really personal. And the privacy commissioner, because everybody in the complex could hear it, was very severe on them. So make sure you have that in place, 1. 2, make sure you're well familiar and your entire board is familiar with the restrictions exemption program, and then document what that means specifically for your site, and put notes up, explain what that is, whatever solution or whatever decision you've crafted. And then, as Victoria said, you're expected to then comply with it consistently. throughout it's not just we're going to use it for 2 weeks. No, it's until this public state of health emergency is over, you're expected to comply with everything in that restrictions exemption program.
Yeah, my comments will be more on the practical, and let's just say it's a gym, an in-building fitness room or gym. Some of them are locked, some of them are not. Some people have fobs where you can get into the fitness room, others cannot. So now we run into a practical thing. You have to consistently comply with it, which means, to me, one of two things. Either you're going to have somebody at the door at all times checking people's status as they come in, or if you're going to make people, provide all their documentation one time, then keep a list of it. Number one, you're now holding confidential medical information. You better have your policy in place, as Hugh said. But number two, how are you going to keep other people out? Are only those people who have passed it going to be issued keys or fobs for that room? So there's all kinds of things you're going to have to think through that are going to make it very difficult. And remember, you as the board, and in this case, property manager, have to monitor it and have to have records proving you're monitoring it and be available to be audited at any time by the government if they should so choose to do so.
And then just to jump one last thing here is so how do we know that this restricting exemption program applies to our amenities room? In one of the orders here, and actually in the government issue, the information the government has just issued in the past week, in addition to restaurants, nightclubs, and sporting events and rec classes, they do have categorization of amenities in hotels and condos. And it's clear that the amenities rooms in condos do apply, or the restrictions exemption program would apply to those spaces. So the only way you're able to use those spaces is in conjunction with the restrictions exemption program.
So Hugh, thank you for circling back on that. We did just want to clarify. So a lot of work ahead for boards and corporations that want to use the restriction exemption program to keep their amenities open. Is it possible for amenities to be open for condo corporations that are not going to apply the restriction exemptions program?
Based on my reading of the information from the province, the answer is no, that those spaces would not be applicable or would not be permitted to be opened without the restrictions exemption program.
Okay.
I agree with you on that. And I guess I would add in, why would you want to? It's you're taking on such a huge amount of liability. Best, I think, to put it off, or any thought of it, until this crisis has passed.
Sorry,
let me jump in.
It's a complicated area.
Yeah, like I agree with Victoria. Like I think it's, are you able to operate? There's a bit of ambiguity here in potentially the information from the province. However, is it reasonable and prudent to do so? No. I think a board would be in very difficult standing to demonstrate it being a prudent decision in a public state of health emergency to not follow the directions of the province.
Thank you both.
You're taking personal liability on at that point.
Yeah, when the courts look at these sorts of things, and hopefully it would never get to court, I mean, they can either look at a strict interpretation or a broader interpretation. Under all COVID cases that have gone before the courts, they've taken the broader look at it. These restrictions are in here to protect public health, so we don't try to split hairs.
Thank you both. Here's another question about AGMs. As you both know, and as most of our attendees I'm sure are aware, the Act requires that annual general meetings are held not more than 15 months apart. During the first state of emergency that was declared for COVID-19, the minister issued an exemption that allowed boards to delay their AGMs. Folks just looking for clarification about whether a similar exemption has been granted under this provincial state of emergency, or if that 15-month deadline still applies.
That previous order is finished. It's done now, And because we can now have electronic meetings, I do not expect there will be any kind of other order from the province giving any sort of other suspension in the timeline.
Yeah, I concur. I think the expectation now with electronic meetings is that you should hold them. Like there's ways you can do your AGMs. I know some people say, well, hey, our site doesn't, our people don't do Zoom. Maybe that's changed. A, it's been a year and a half, but B, you can even do conference call. It's a bit more challenging to administer, but you can still do a conference call.
Thanks for you both. This kind of gets more into Bill 53 than COVID, but since it has to do with folks trying to figure out how to have AGM safely, I'm going to allow it. Could we just touch briefly on if a board's bylaws haven't been amended to provide additional guidance on this since the passage of Bill 53, what's the state of play around offering in-person, telephone, and digital options for AGMs? What do they have to do on the AGM side? Vicky, would you mind taking a stab at that?
Okay, sure. First off, let's talk a bit about board meetings. Board meetings, since 2000, I think, we could have electronically. The requirement is that everybody who participates in that board meeting can hear and be heard so that the board members know what's going on. So that one's off the table. You've been able to do it electronically for a long time, and many boards have. As we've mentioned, as of March 26th of this year, all AGMs not only can, but must have an electronic component. The government did not set any really tight requirements, excepting that they must be able to participate fully in the meeting. So as a basic requirement, they have to be able to hear, and they have to be able to be heard. It might be a Zoom meeting like this one, where if you've got a camera, it's focused on the chairperson of the meeting, and those people who can attend by video can attend by video and use the hands up feature if they want to speak, or if it's, people can attend without a camera and attend by audio, as long as you can be heard and you can hear what's going on and you can vote. Those are kind of the basic requirements. Now, there are a couple of commercial programs that have been developed specifically for condo AGMs. I will say I've not been at a meeting using one of those programs, but I have heard some feedback that they work okay. You can use Zoom, and depending on how many people are attending, it can work fine. And depending on how experienced the people who are managing it, like Amanda, are, it can work absolutely fine. But you've got to be able to participate, which means hear, be heard, and vote.
And it's Hugh here. I'm gonna jump in and just add that it's the corporation's decision on the participation of it. So if your owners are expecting that they can attend by telephone, then they're allowed to vote. I know we've had some discussions with sometimes the software platforms don't easily dovetail with people on a telephone. So in my mind, you would just, if those people who are voting using the software, clickety-click, and then you would just ask to unmute the people on phone. How do you vote, yes or no? Phone number that ends in 1234. How do you vote, yes or no? And deal with it that way. But it's just because it's inconvenient doesn't mean you get to disenfranchise the owner. Now, if you were going to try and say we're holding it by Zoom and we're not going to allow anybody to attend by telephone on Zoom, I think you need to make that absolutely clear in your notice that goes out weeks and weeks in advance. And even then, is that what your owners are expecting? If your owners' notice has gone out and owners think they can attend by Zoom because by telephone through Zoom, because there's a phone number added, they got to be allowed to vote.
Thank you both for taking some time to run through that at a high level. I know folks have some specific questions about this issue in the chat. Unfortunately, there's just, well, not unfortunately, it's great actually that there's such a variety of condominiums in Alberta, but we just can't kind of get into the level of specific detail that some folks are going to need to navigate this with their owners. So Hugh and Victoria have provided some really good best practices, but if you're nervous about this, it's not a bad idea to talk to your condominium corporation's lawyer and get their advice on what's going to best meet your legal obligations and meet your owners where they're at to make sure that they're all franchised. So
yeah, and then just to clarify, like again, if the platform, the electronic platform lets you capture most owners, great, absolutely. But then take the 2 or 3 minutes it takes just to go through those people on phone and make sure they have the ability to participate in the vote as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Hugh.
I guess I would just add, this part of AGMs, don't leave it to the last minute to organize it. Even if your AGM isn't until December or January, start planning how you're going to do the electronic component now, because there's lots of options and lots of details you're going to have to take care of. And there may be people that you're going to have to provide some extra assistance or education to get them able to attend.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you for that note, Vicki. Anything else? Sorry, I cut you off there. I didn't mean to.
No, that's fine.
Okay. And that's really great advice to start planning in advance. CCI North Alberta's AGM is going to be on October 26th, and we are working through this problem right now. So I look forward to sharing a little bit about that experience in the winter issue of our magazine. Next question. The COVID-19 rule, actually, we have about 15 minutes to go, so we're just going to kind of bang through as many questions as we can get to. The restrictions have a number of exemptions for places of worship. If a condo AGM is being held in a church, does it follow the place of worship restrictions or the restrictions that apply to other types of facilities?
I haven't come across that one before, but my opinion is because it is not a worship service or a funeral or a wedding, that you would have to require comply with the other requirements.
Yeah, that would be my take as well.
Thank you both. Let's scroll down here. Is a corporation allowed to only ask vaccinated tradesmen and vendors to work with the property? Who would be the one to ensure that they are checking their passport? And that question is from Joanna.
I would say yes. I think you are entitled to ask that question. I would direct the question to the company and say, as part of your contract, we required vaccinated or exempt persons to be on site, and we would ask that you, assign appropriate staff accordingly. And then, in the event that there's you're checking, I guess who's coming in, it would be either the condo manager or potentially a board member, subject to all of your privacy obligations and so on. But I would direct the question to the company.
Thanks, Hugh. Vicki,
I agree.
You agree?
I agree.
Great. Okay. Folks, just want to circle back to the mask question for a second. So we've covered the fact that condo corporations can require masks in common areas, but must they? Is that a area of discretion or a rule?
My understanding is that at least here in Edmonton, the municipal authorities have deemed the common hallways an indoor public space, and they have been treating it that's how it's being interpreted. I would expect that would be consistent throughout the province. So my expectation is that the authorities would be enforcing the mask requirement in hallways and elevators in condominiums.
Just a comment about these letters of exemption. The orders are very clear. Letters of exemption for masking must be written by nurse practitioners, physicians, or psychologists. And the nurse practitioner, physician, or psychologist must clearly identify themselves, who they are, what their capacity is, their contact information. They do not have to state why the person is exempt. That's their call. They simply have to say the person is exempt. If you're checking these things, you check to make sure that it is one of the proper individuals that has signed that letter. When it comes to the exemption program that allows, where the letter where you're vaccinated or have an exemption, those can only be signed by nurse practitioners or physicians. Again, they don't have to state the reason for the exemption. They simply have to state that the person is exempt under the legislation. Again, your requirement, if you're checking these things, is to make sure they are properly signed by either a nurse practitioner or a physician, and that all of the proper identification information is on the face of that letter.
Thank you, Vicky. Sorry, I cut you off again. We'll get better at this. Did you have anything else there?
No. That's
okay.
all for me.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I didn't mean there, but just there's exemptions and then there's exemptions. So the restriction exemption program is what the government is calling the program that you can opt into to require proof of vaccine. What Vicky is talking about around letters that need to be signed by the appropriate healthcare professional is there are folks who have a need to have a medical exemption from wearing a mask. So just so that that's clear for people. While we're on masks, a little bit of a tough question that a few folks have asked. Do you have any advice for handling people who refuse to wear masks inside of building and common areas, assuming without that exemption?
I would handle that the same way as I would handle anybody who's making someone feel unsafe in their home. You contact the appropriate authorities, period. If they were screaming and yelling and pounding on the doors, you would call the police. In this circumstance, our provincial authorities have declared the circumstances severe enough that we would require a public state of health emergency. You contact the city, you contact your municipal authority to have it enforced.
Vicky, do you want to chime in there, or is that pretty straightforward?
I agree with that. If you are phoning to register your complaint, make sure you've got details, who it was, what time it was, those sorts of things. The normal sort of thing you would do for a bylaw enforcement. You have to have it detailed, not just sometimes Joe comes in without his mask.
Great, thank you. A couple of folks have asked this question. Do condo corporations need to provide hand sanitizer in common areas and amenities?
Is it reasonable and prudent in the face of a public state of health emergency to have sanitizer in public common spaces? Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I'm just reading through. There's a number of questions on masks, but I think we've addressed most of them. Actually, no, this is a helpful question to build on a little bit on what we've already talked about. On the issue of masks in common areas, what do condos rely on to enforce that requirement if the condo corporation doesn't have a bylaw or rule that addresses it?
Most corporations will have a bylaw that requires them to follow the direction of any provincial, federal, or municipal authority. And you have this direction from the chief medical officer for the province. So that's what you would be relying on for the enforcement. And furthermore, is the board the right mechanism to do the enforcement? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but there will be cases you'll flip over to the municipal or provincial authorities.
Thanks, Hugh.
I just to perhaps reinforce what Hugh said, you do not need something in your bylaws to authorize you to phone the public health authorities 311 or 811 because the order prevails over your bylaws.
Great, thank you both. To folks who are waiting, sorry, Vicky, go ahead.
No, that was fine. I didn't say another thing. I just breathed too heavily into the mic.
Maybe a little glitch in the matrix or something. To folks who are patiently waiting to have their question answered, I am doing my level best to get as many of them as we can. There are a lot. So bear with me. And I'm just kind of skimming through to try and catch ones where more than one person had the same question. If you're noticing that I'm going out of order, that's what's going on. Or a topic that we haven't addressed yet, which is this question. For board meetings, a number of condos have board meetings coming up. What are the rules or restrictions for in-person attendees at board meetings? Are in-person meetings even allowed? And what, if they are, what guidelines would people need to keep in mind? Maybe we haven't had Vicky start in a while. There we go.
I'll take a stab at that. First of all, as was said, I think the most reasonable and prudent thing at this point in time is to do your board meeting electronically, either by telephone conference or Zoom or something else. That's your safest, your best option to do it. And that's allowable by the legislation, and so you can do it that way, and that's what I would recommend. If you insist on doing an in-person meeting, we do have part of the order says that gatherings are prohibited unless they are your cohort. So that's private social gatherings. I didn't see anything about a private small business gathering that would apply to a board meeting size. But if you did have one, you'd have to have masking. You'd have to have social distancing of at least 2 meters between each person, preferably partitions. It could become cumbersome, so it would depend on where you were holding this meeting. Hugh, have you seen anything that would specifically apply to a prohibition or an authorization for a board meeting?
No, and that's where we're still waiting for the info. I think, you are conducting business, so you could look and say that, this is a business meeting. That being said, I keep going back to, is it reasonable and prudent? And that is the lens that the board will be evaluated through. And likely you're going to be evaluated through that lens after the fact, post-incident. And so in that circumstance, what was being done in that meeting to keep people relatively safe, and given that the legislation allows you to do this using technology through Zoom or through a conference call, why didn't you do so?
If your board meeting is going to be in someone's unit, I would say absolutely no, because there is a prohibition against that. But if it were to be in a social room or something, it's a little grayer, and as you said, we need more guidance on that.
Thank you. We're coming close on time. I'm going to try and fit probably 2 more questions in. First question is about just making sure that folks have access to an AGM. So if a corporation wishes to hold an in-person annual general meeting, say at a facility using the exemption programs, like a conference facility, would the corporation need to offer reimbursement for those who have to get a test result in order to attend? The concern the person is hoping you'll address is the requirement to make sure that owners are franchised and allow owners to attend the meeting.
My answer to that would be absolutely not. The cost of getting a test is the person who wants to attend.
Yeah, and I would also add, there's other ways for that person to attend the meeting, right?
Yeah.
By giving a proxy or by requesting to participate electronically.
Thanks, Hugh. We have a little bit more time. So just back to the pre-recorded question, I think this one's actually kind of important to get to before we wrap up today. Should we be asking owners or residents to notify the property manager or the corporation if someone does test positive for COVID and are in quarantine? Obviously, we would expect that information to be confidential and only used to ensure that the board is taking the measures it needs to be safe. But should you be putting out that call for information? And if so, what do you have to be careful of? Give folks a minute to think about that one, because it's a sticky one, and then we'll go to Vicky.
Okay, it is a sticky one. I have concerns about the board having private health information, and it must be held confidentially and properly if it's held. However, on the other side, is it reasonable and prudent for the board to know about it? Yes. And is it reasonable and prudent for the board to post signs saying we have been advised that someone has tested positive in this building and is now in quarantine? Absolutely. And recommending that everyone in the building gets a test? Absolutely. So I think it's a good idea if the board knows, because then the board can take steps to protect other individuals. If the board knows someone is supposed to be quarantining and they are not, then that is a call to the appropriate authorities.
And I'll jump in and raise the question, does every single board member need to know who it was? And as part of your scenario planning with the privacy officer, is it maybe just the information the board needs to be aware of is that someone on site has tested positive, not necessarily somebody in unit blank, 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 right? Is, okay, we've had a positive test, now let's implement our strategy with the additional sanitizing stations, additional cleaning, the notification, and so on. So, especially if you have a board that is prone to be a bit leaky on information, where somebody tells their partner and the partner tells their friends at coffee and so on, so on, so on, so. Maybe talk about it in advance and say, okay, what, can we set up a process or a protocol that maybe only one or two board members need to know who the specific individual is?
Thank you, Hugh. And with that, we are at time. So unfortunately, that's the end of the questions we're going to get to. We really appreciate Hugh and Vicky's time for and expertise here. We will send around a recording of this session, plus some of those links we promised. And before we wrap up, Hugh and Vicky, I'll leave it to you. Do you have any last words or, big picture pieces of advice that you'd like to leave people with? Hugh, let's go to you first.
Sure. I think, getting ahead of some of this stuff and being open with your discussions with the owner, saying, so just sending a short newsletter or a note, simply saying, hey, we're dealing with these challenges. We're trying to come up with the best solution. That sort of communication helps build confidence with your ownership, because owners now say, okay, hey, well, the board is paying attention. They are on top of this. It is a moving target. The instructions are moving. Follow the instructions of our public health officers, and do what you can. And playing catch up on this, where you're a day before your AGM and you hadn't put your mind to some of these issues, could very well be just make your life a whole lot more difficult than it needs to be.
Thank you, Hugh. Vicky?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Hugh has said. Particularly, everything you do, view through reasonable and prudent lens. Next of all, just as many of the people on the call today have probably not actually physically seen the orders or the guidance documents, I would say that would be even more true for many of the residences living in your buildings and your developments. If you have a website or a way of posting some of these things. Now, you probably couldn't post it on a bulletin board because some of them are 15, 16 pages long, but a website would be ideal, getting these documents out to the people so they can actually, if they choose to, take the time and see what you have to do and what they are expected to do, so that with some, they realize that some of the more onerous things that you have to do, it's because you are required to do them, not just because boards are overstepping their authority.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really helpful note to leave us on. So again, thank you so much to Hugh and Victoria for doing a bunch of rapid fire research and lending us their time and talents today. To folks who joined us on the call today, thank you for your participation and your patience. We hope this was really helpful. We will be sending out this recording with those links, and CCI North Alberta is closely monitoring the ever-changing situation with COVID. when we get a big update, like another state of emergency, we do try to put together something interactive like this so that you can get your questions answered. But our weekly newsletter also includes a bulletin every time there is an update on COVID-19, a big update on COVID-19 restrictions. So if you haven't subscribed to that tool already, I encourage you to do so. And we will be continuing to post resources as they are available from the government. Other than that, stay reasonable, stay safe, and thank you so much for attending.
Thank you all.
Have a great day.